Good morning, welcome everybody. So I'm Peter Littlewood, and I'm really very pleased to welcome you to this special Directors Colloquium, which I think is going to be in the form of a discussion as much between me and, of course, a very distinguished former Director of Argonne, Walter Massey. So I'm very pleased to welcome him today. He's currently President of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's a member of Argonne's Board of Governors and Director of Argonne from 1979 to 1984. He's had a remarkable career. So he was born in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. He received a Ford Foundation scholarship in high school to attend Morehouse College at 16. He received his PhD in physics from Washington University in St. Louis. And he first joined Argonne as a postdoc in 1966. He has been associated with the lab, I think, probably as long as anybody in the audience. And many of the postdocs here can look forward to a career as spectacular as Walter's, because we give people a great start. Close to my own heart, his scientific research was in quantum fluids, in particular helium-3, helium-4 mixtures. I remember as a graduate student, I was sent off to read some of those papers. And he was a professor of physics and dean of the college at Brown University when he was asked to become director at Argonne. So he returned to Chicago and led the lab through some of its most uncertain years. He responded by reorganizing the nuclear programs, renewing the focus on transferring technology, and bringing the intense pulse neutron source, the IPNS, online. Since then, if being director of Argonne isn't enough, he served as director of the National Science Foundation, provost of the University of California Labs and School System, president of his alma mater, Morehouse College, director and chairman of the board of Bank of America, member of the President's Council of Advisors, and received more than 30 honorary degrees from institutions such as Yale, Northwestern, and Amherst, to share just a few highlights of an extraordinary career. He's also been consistently committed to expanding opportunities for minority students in STEM education and careers, developing an inner-city teaching program at Brown, and serving as a founding trustee of the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy. One of his recent endeavors, the Walter E. Massey Leadership Center at the historically black men's college Morehouse, created programs to distill and teach a Morehouse style of leadership in which creative individuals are the catalyst for social change. He's had a prolific and varied career as an executive and as a leader, navigating opportunities and challenges across a great many fields, and through many challenges in politics, science, and the paradigms about how we manage. And so I'm really delighted to be able to have Walter here, and we're going to explore some of these in conversation, and I'm sure take some questions from the audience. So please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Walter Massey. Thanks, Walter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. So Walter, thank you so much for being with us. It's a great inspiration. And I promise to be nice to you, and I have to be nice. You should understand that he's still my boss, actually. Because the board of directors is actually a very distinguished group of people, and they really play an important role in guiding Argonne. They're not necessarily visible here, but Walter is certainly one of those. And actually, I think one of the things that you were involved with at various times was setting up the board of directors.
Correct.
And setting up the way actually Argonne is structured and managed. And I wonder if you've got comments about, when you came back here in 1979, it was trying times. There were folks who thought that nuclear power was over and Argonne should be closed down. How did you deal with all of that? Your thoughts?
That's right. There were very, very turbulent times. 79, I recall, I was at Brown University, and I was being congratulated on being chosen as director of Argonne, and I think it was maybe 3 weeks later, 3 Mile Island happened. And so the whole, the issue of nuclear power in the country and the safety of it became at the forefront of public discussion, and people at Argonne, I saw Marty Steinler out there, probably others, Argonne was very much engaged in helping to try to understand that event. So we were thrown into the middle of it. But after that, then Jimmy Carter was really not that much supportive of nuclear research, and that was our major program then. And we had another lab, of course. We had Idaho, Argonne West, which was sort of the place where a lot of the EBR-2 was. And then Ronald Reagan came in, and he was supportive of the nuclear program, but he was very much against alternative energies. And the budget really suffered a great deal. And I think about 81, 82, the lab was maybe, this lab, not our, Idaho's, about 3,000. We had to lay off almost 600 people, probably over 600. So they were uncertain times, but people rallied around. We crafted a new vision, worked very closely with the university and DOE, and came out of it.
Right. No, it's a sort of, I mean, I think, no, looking back on this, of course, I'm a newbie here. I don't know my way around at all, but trying to understand the history of Argonne. That, I think, was the point where kind of Argonne was relaunched on a different set of directions. I mean, I was noticing that as well as writing articles in quantum fluids, in the early 80s, you wrote, I think, an influential article in Science calling for the establishment of major facilities for X-ray sources and the like, right? So that that, you know, some years later became the institution which is behind us here. And you were just saying you've never been in this auditorium before.
I've never.
So this is right. So you know, sorry we didn't do this because you should have cut the ribbon on this place because.
Well, I came, you know, to the facility itself, but I don't recall coming to the auditorium. But there were the issues, some of the major issues at that time, and they keep recurring. Is what's interesting. The role of the national laboratories and the American Science and R&D establishment is something that comes up, it seems, on a cyclical basis. And that, during those early periods in the 80s, that came up. And there were two sort of issues being mentioned, maybe more than that. One was, how did the scientists at the laboratories, how did they compete with or not compete with scientists in universities? That seems to me that's been ameliorated somewhat over the years, but it was quite a serious debate. Scientists in universities really did not see that scientists in national labs had to compete for research grants as they did. They thought all the money sort of came out of the sky from DOE. And on the industry side, there was this feeling that the laboratories were not really contributing that much to national competitiveness, which was the word. Of course, that was before the Bayh-Dole Act, and that was before you could really do technology transfer or have strong relations with industry. So both sides of those issues from industry and from universities were being felt. So it was clear that a national lab, at least in my view, and I think that's still true now, had to have at least three things. One, a major research program that was energy-based. And that was, for us then, that was nuclear. That was nuclear R&D. So we really decided to try to double down on that. And there are people here who worked on that, and a guy named Chuck Teal who took that over and really created, I think, a strong program, and we began to get support. The other was to have a major facility, because if university scientists did not see the lab helping their science, then they didn't feel it should be supported. And we had the IPNS, and we had a competition for a, Murray Peshkin, this may remember, for an electron accelerator, HGV electron accelerator. And it was a competition between the Southeastern Universities Research Association, SURA, had about 11 states competing, and we were competing for it. And it got very political, got very heavily political, as well as scientifically competitive. But we lost that, initiative to get the HGEV, and that's when we began to focus on the APS, because we needed a major facility, and so we got that effort started. And the third thing, a major facility, a major energy-based research program, and excellence in science. I mean, an excellent science and technology base. so that you could refute the arguments that the science at national labs was not competitive or the same quality as the best research universities.
Yeah, no, I mean, my view, by the way, I think is that that remains true today, which is the, and sort of a slightly British comment on this, which comes to mind, because I was just moving to the US at around that time. In fact, I moved to Bell Labs as a postdoc at the time you were taking over as the director here. And one of the reasons I left the UK was that there was a war on in the UK between the universities and the national labs. So you had Ronald Reagan, we had Margaret Thatcher. They had kind of similar views about how this should be done. And what actually happened what actually happened to the national labs in the UK is that they were left just as user facilities. And the stuff about them which was doing work with industry was actually privatized. And the science was hollowed out. And it's left those organizations very thin as a result of doing that. It has some interesting effects. The privatization made a lot of people rich, because it turns out that the folks working in the labs, of course, have great opportunity, great skills, great ability, actually, to move technology to the market. And it became clear both there and I think then here that making that opportunity real for folks at the labs without having to eject them from the labs was one of the things that we needed to do. So this is sort of a long-winded way of getting around to one of the things that you did, I think, which was to begin to focus on technology transfer, tech to market, which is something that we continue to do now. Do you see that role growing now at the labs? Is that something that we should be doing more of? Have we got the right balance?
I'm not sure. I don't know enough to say whether the labs or even Argonne has the right balance. But I don't think that's a matter of debate anymore. I mean, it was a matter of national debate, policy debate, whether the government-funded research should be allowed to be privatized or spun off in any way until the Bayh-Dole Act. I think now the discussion is around how best to do it and what's appropriate, what are the appropriate reward structures for the individuals, for the institutions, what are the appropriate institutional processes you have to put in place, who are the right partners. So I think things have changed dramatically, and the idea that this is legitimate, I think it's really in the past that it is legitimate.
Yeah, no, that's sort of fascinating, actually. So, you've been a leader in in a bunch of scientific fields for now several decades, but you've led in different organizations. You've led in organizations like Argonne, at the NSF, at Morehouse. Is there some common thread to the way that those things go, or do you need a different style for each place?
Well, you can't change yourself. But when I came to the lab, I was 41 years old. And I had never been in charge. I'm not sure the director's in charge, Peter, right. But I'd never had the title of director of anything as large and as complex. I was dean of a college at a liberal arts college at Brown. So when people ask me about your leadership style, I'm not sure I had a leadership style. One learns. So looking back, I can see now common things, but also can see where I made mistakes. And I think that's part of developing a leadership style is you make mistakes and you learn from them. So one of the things that I have learned over the years is the importance of listening to people in the organization, of really trying to find ways to keep in touch with the culture of the organization or the people who you might not ordinarily encounter in the in the everyday part of your job. And the jobs, as you know, this jobs are all consuming. I mean, you could spend all of your time in Washington, you could spend all of your time, working with industry, you could spend all your time working with the board. Each one could be a full-time job. So that became very important. And I think with Marty, so reminded me that I remember I used to have brown bag lunches, and anyone could come. You know, you'd have to sign up because we couldn't. They were actually in the office. You couldn't get that many people in. But I wanted to really hear, because what people were thinking. Some of the mistakes I have made is getting too far from the organization's culture, getting too far from knowing what's really going on in the organization. And you can do that because you're expected to represent Morehouse, NSF, any institution. That's the thing that only the director can do. You know, only the director can speak for the lab, can represent it. So you have to do that. And then other things you might, you know, allocate your time across those. The other thing I've learned about leadership is to try to build a culture of collaboration and collegiality. And also had to learn how to delegate, how to learn how to pick good people and allow them to do their jobs. And I've gotten to the point, I've got to it over the years, where my attitude with the people was, if I have to do your job, then we have too many people, and I'm not going anywhere. Right. So, you know, you do your job. Here's your job. We'll report on it. You'll report on it. We'll set standards. But it took me a while to do that because I don't know if you don't trust people when you're young. You think you can do everything better. Or you're just nervous about the organization. The third thing that I have learned over the years is to try to really pick good people, and it's related to the last one, and allow them to be creative and function and give them authority. And when you do not pick the right person, to rectify that as soon as you can. I mean, you're never going to be 100% accurate. And it may not be the person just might not be the person for the job. It's not that they are not qualified to do something else, or maybe your chemistry doesn't fit. So those three things have sort of been common, Peter, in every organization.
I mean, I think that's fascinating. I mean, one of the things I actually notice about Walter is that he's extraordinarily modest and begins his things by explaining all of the mistakes that he's made. And the mistakes were never visible to anybody else, as far as we could tell. But actually, but I think there's sort of a certain view of yourself and trying to be as rational as you possibly can. I mean, probably, one challenge which may have been similar for both of us when we turned up here is that you had a little bit of history with Argonne. I had my history with Argonne, of course, is I knew a whole bunch of scientists because I'd been competing with them for years. But actually to arrive in a new organization, and it takes a long time to discover the depth of talent, the culture, the skills, because, it's buried all over the place at Argonne. Right. It's sort of amazing. I think I've now finally been in all of the buildings at Argonne. I'm not sure. There may be a few sheds out back that I haven't made it to, but it's, but just even knowing what's here, because, as the climate changes, all of a sudden you discover you need a new set of resources to be able to do something.
That's right.
And often you discover it's right here.
Yeah.
There are people and there are skills and there's an ability to do that. And getting that out is a good one. And I also, I'm discovering the challenges of trying to, as you say, speak for the lab. I don't know how you feel, but the way I feel, I've never been in a job where I've had quite so many people who think I work for them.
And you do.
That's right. I tried to make a list the other day, actually, and I rapidly got onto the second page.
That's true.
But
I remember I did. This was my first job after graduating from WashU, my PhD. So I knew something of the culture because I had been postdoc, then a staff scientist, and then I would come back in the summers for a number of years, even when I was at Brown. Right. I'd come back and do research. So I was familiar with that part. But I remember when I came back as director, we had an all-staff meeting, probably the auditorium over at the old ZGS building, High Energy Physics building. And, God, I see his face, I can't remember his name. He was a high energy theoretician. Oh, crusty guy. And I was introduced, and I said something about myself, and he stood up and said, "So, you're just another University of Chicago physicist that's sent out here to watch over us, huh?" Because Bob Sachs had preceded me. And then, and for a number of years, the actual relations between the university and the lab were not that good.
Right.
I mean, people, I think, a lot at the lab saw the university thought the university's primary interest in the lab was to collect the fee. I mean, that was, except maybe in nuclear physics, we had some collaborations, but there were not that many, probably any other serious collaborators. I was one of the few people who had a joint appointment as a faculty member there at the lab. So that was interesting. I mean, I really had to work through that, and I lived in Hyde Park, and I had a faculty appointment to really convince people that the lab was my priority,
right,
not the university. Yeah, I worked for Argonne, you know, even though the university was the manager of the lab.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Well, also, I don't know whether it's true, but I have a sense at that time that you were brought in as an outsider because, you know, challenges were on the horizon. But when you came here, there would be plenty of Manhattan Project veterans,
right,
who figured they knew how the lab ran and what to do. As you say, there are these sort of distinguished, you know, theorists and the like. So, you know, that must have been quite a challenge, actually, to come in and deal with that. So what was your approach?
Well, it was not a challenge in the sense that I was not accepted. I really, you know, looking back and I've thought about it, people at the lab were very, very accepting of me as director, even realizing that I came with little experience in running an institution this big, and that I really had no experience in nuclear energy research. And as I said, that was the big field here. That was sort of our anchor. The guy, Bob Laney, was a guy named Bob Laney, who had been deputy lab director, and I think a number of people thought he should have been director. And he wasn't chosen. I was chosen. Bob was very generous and gracious, and I really learned a lot. I mean, I really had to bone up. I read a lot. I went to colloquial seminars, met with people over in the nuclear program. I just had them tutor me, you know, on what the issues were. So it wasn't. I wasn't rejected. I felt I was embraced by the laboratory, and that was back to the thing you asked me about, the style. And I'm not sure where I started doing this, but I really seriously listened to the people and made it clear that I didn't consider myself an expert. I had views on things, but that you know, I was here to learn. I had many discussions about the breeder reactor research program because when I came, I wasn't clear. It wasn't clear intellectually to me as a scientist or as a person, a member of the public, that this was something we should stake our future on. And I had to be convinced of that. And I was convinced of it, and we were able to, I think, move that forward to the point where we made a big difference. This lab made a big difference. I think one of the things, I'm waiting to see the nation catch up with that view that this is an important energy source.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's an interesting one because, of course, you know, we continue to push hard on this. I mean, it's a signature project of the lab. And as you say, I don't know whether the nation will catch up, but other nations seem to be catching up.
Yeah.
And that, I think, produces a kind of a sort of a different challenge now. I mean, were you conscious of big international interactions in nuclear at the time you were lab director, Or did Argonne feel like very much like a United States DOE lab?
No, we had a number of international activities, a lot centered around at Idaho. But here it was not, the thing about the nuclear program is that it also was supported by, involved, a lot of the sciences, especially chemical engineering, chemistry, material scientists. All of those things, as you know, historically, a lot of the kind of research we did here in those fields grew out of some of the early needs in that program. So the international activities and relations throughout the lab were quite extensive in all of those areas.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so it's sort of
we used to have dogs, right? What were they? Beagles.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right.
You could hear the beagles barking when you
came.
When you came into the laboratory, and they were used for radiation-related research. Quite a few of them. And one of the things I was trying to do was to make the laboratory more well-known in the city of Chicago, to have people appreciate it, because early on then, people still thought we did, ultra-secret research. They confused nuclear energy with nuclear weapons in the city. So I began to bring people out for picnics and have dinners and parties at the lodge. And one day we had a very prominent group coming out, a number of women from Chicago. I can't remember the name of the group now. We'd invited out. And I was showing them around the lab, and we passed by the building where the dogs were, and you could hear them barking. And they said, what are those? I explained what they were. It didn't dawn on me that we would have people who thought that was cruelty to animals and were not impressed by our research on beagles. But that was another thing that was important then, Peter. I know you're working on it. The university has become much more helpful in that regard, is to get the message of what the laboratory does out into the broader community outside of the laboratory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually remains a challenge. I mean, we do our best to have lots of interactions. I think, over the years, we've been growing into the city in an important way. And I think my own view, and a lot of my colleagues' view, is that there are huge opportunities for Argonne to invest as a regional lab, where we're doing things in partnership with not just the universities, but the city and the state, addressing issues like water, the work we're doing with electrical storage, have it not just be an academic exercise that produces a better battery, but actually something which really helps companies take products to market, as we've done. And to do that in a way of being seen as a resource. And I've watched that even grow during the time that I've been here. And there's many reasons why I think that's important. One, of course, is that it just is important to do it. It's certainly important to the lab because we need the support of the community. It's still the case that you meet people on the street and you ask them if they know about Argonne. And to the extent that they've heard about labs, they might have heard about Fermi labs, so they get us confused with Fermi labs. Because we don't have a straightforward brand. Although, we're working hard, I think, on pushing out what is our brand, and our brand is we are really here to make the world better. And understanding that we have a broad portfolio around energy and it's not just something which is point-like, that we're actually an engine of science and technology and an engine of the local economy, is something that we're working hard to not just make happen, but also be seen to be visible in making happen. So occasionally we get the attention. There's this new book out that some of you may see, and we were discussing today by Steve Levine about the powerhouse. And one of the quotes in that, and I think this one is really true, was when the lab won the J. Caesar Hub. And at the moment that we won that, all of the politicians grabbed hold of it and started running press conferences, and particularly the mayor. And there's this wonderful side comment that I think that the mayor made to my predecessor, where Eric said, we're really proud to have won the hub. And the mayor said, I got you the hub.
That's our mayor.
Right, but by the way, that's the situation we want to be in. Right, no, to have the mayor of Chicago think that Argonne is his project is a big deal. And I'll let him believe that, you know, he...
Let's do it.
one is the hub in order to do that.
Right,
so,
right.
So it's very interesting. So I want to turn over a little bit to science education, because you've been very involved in science education, all of the roles that you have. I mean, science education broadly, and of course STEM education for women and minorities and beyond that. So question, how do you see that Argonne can contribute to this? What should we be doing? What are our opportunities? What are the ways that we can play in the national agenda on this?
I think there's several ways, and we've been talking about this at some of our board meetings. There was a time when actually DOE had a program to support science education in the laboratories. And they had a budget, and the labs could draw on. And I recall we started programs of partnerships with with high schools in the Chicago area and the suburban area here. But so I was thinking through institutionally, to the degree that the laboratory can partner with institutions, high schools, junior colleges, and others, is great, and because the lab has so much scientific and technical knowledge embedded here that typical high schools certainly don't have, and even some colleges in the area don't have. The other is the work of the individuals, and to the extent that you volunteer or work in your communities in these programs, science education, working with youngsters, and it's seen that you are a member of the Argonne community. You have a scientist from Argonne. And I know this happens because I'm on this committee, the Pinnacle of Excellence Award, that gives the awards for people who work and represent the laboratory in the external community. So that makes a big difference. The third would be wonderful if one could, in your laboratory's Directors Council, somehow get the emphasis on science, tech, STEM education back to at a DOE level. And I'm not sure what's happening at a national policy level here, but the national labs as a complex are such a rich resource, maybe the largest single complex it is, of course, in the nation, the largest number of scientists and engineers, chemists, biologists across fields, that if you could bring that attention to this issue back at a national level, I think it would make a big difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think...
I don't know what's happening there.
Well, it's very complicated. So firstly, I think that we do have a Secretary of Energy for which this is an important focus. Ernie cares about this.
He does.
I mean, he thinks about it very broadly. He's very thoughtful about it. He's pushing very hard. The programs that you've mentioned about being able to actually have training within the DOE, typically get crossed out by Congress at various points, because Congress says, well, NSF is supposed to be doing training.
Or the Department of Education. Right?
Or Department of Education, right? So getting that mission back in there. We have actually, I think, a few small ones there, because we can argue, and we are arguing, that there are specific areas where the labs work where it's very difficult for us to recruit and train, because there are special things that we do for the nation that don't happen in most other places, nuclear chemistry being one. Right?
Okay.
So I think that there are inroads on that which may work. I think the labs together, and this is new, that all of the lab directors are working together. We've established a new workforce working group to try and think broadly about, about issues that will affect the lab system. Things like you might notice that, by 2050, more than half of the population of the country will be a minority. Well, that's a funny name, actually, if you're more than that.
There will be no majority.
That's right. So folks like me are going out of business, right? So we need to make sure that we're setting up to be able to broadly adapt to the workforce we have. Actually, just internationally, it was reminded me on Friday that in 2050 also 40% of the youth population under 21 will be in Africa. Right, so not just thinking locally, but very broadly about how we work on that. So we need to get out there and do stuff, and we need to do it collectively. And you're right that if you look in Chicago even, there are more physical scientists with PhDs at Argonne than there are at the University of Chicago.
Yeah.
We are actually the resource that can do this. And of course, many of us devote their time to outreach of all kinds, and it's a sort of wonderful tapestry, actually, of stuff that comes out of the lab. But it's almost invisible. And scaling that up and getting it there is I think, a big challenge for us. So it's sort of an interesting thought. Just looking at time, and I think it might be a good time now, if you're happy, Walter, to see if we wouldn't like to take some questions from the audience.
Sounds good.
So I'm kind of looking out there. This isn't usually a shy group, but so that,
Takes a while. It always does.
Right.
It should be on.
You're on now, Tina.
Okay, sorry. Hi, thanks for being here. This is very inspiring. I'm Tina Henney. I'm the postdoc program lead. Here at Argonne, and I have a ton of questions I'd like to ask you. But first and foremost, I'll just ask one. I'm not going to monopolize the conversation.
One big question.
One thing that I'm really curious to know is you've worked with scientists all your life, and now you're at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm wondering if there's a difference, if it's easier to work with artists than it is scientists, or vice versa.
I'm asked that all the time. And it's interesting. There are people in the arts who will say, well, this must be so different, they think. And I said, well, that means you don't really understand scientists. There are differences, but there are many similarities. There are many similarities. And the similarities, I think, have to do with the people in both fields who really have this sort of passion for what they do. They have this intense curiosity about the world. They want to express it. They have a commitment, to what they're doing. And they are sort of seeking to explain things, but in different ways. Artists are different from scientists, I'm finding, in the ways they are trying to find the truth, or understand the world, and represent it. But that passion, the creativity, the curiosity, and the, I don't want to insult artists or scientists, the kind of a little craziness that we all have in these fields, or the individualistic personalities are very similar in many ways.
Great to see you back here, Walter, on the
Thank
campus.
you.
There's one aspect of your leadership that I'd like to remark upon. Was the emphasis on horizontal communication within the laboratory. And I'll use one example for that. You may remember that on your watch, we started this laboratory-wide colloquium series that is now being continued. It has been continued ever since you were here. Perhaps the most important debate we had in those days was whether special referred to the colloquium or to the director.
Yes.
But in all seriousness, the laboratory-wide colloquium series, I think, was a great development in the laboratory because it represented that type of horizontal communication that we needed and that we still need within the lab.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, you referred to it earlier, one of the interesting challenges is communication. So because I'm newer to this than him, so what I know is every time I move up a level of management, fewer people tell me the truth. So figuring out what's actually happening is important, and of course, neither of us would ever assume that it's up to us to try and figure out what's important, because it has to come through. And developing channels, not just channels that goes upwards, but channels that go sideways and channels that go round, is always an interesting challenge. I mean, Walter, you created a number of structures to do that through your career. You mentioned sort of brown bag lunches. We just heard colloquia. There are other things you would advise, because, of course, this doesn't apply just to being lab director. It applies to everybody with an organization under them.
Well, not everybody, but there are directors, right? The ALDs, the division directors, program directors, and some of the things you want to happen in an organization is for people who are managers and directors themselves to at least see what you do. And, hopefully then they will carry that down through the organization, which means it's very important, what you do, what signals you send, what you say. But this issue of getting direct feedback and having people argue with you, the higher up you get, really does become more of an issue. When you're in the lab, or you're a theoretician, or you're working, of course, people argue with you. I mean, that's what you do, right? That's what it's all about in the sciences, is that argumentation. It's sometimes hard to convince people who work for you directly that it's all right for them to argue with you, and that they are not going to win all the time, right? But that's what you expect. And even when I went to the School of the Art Institute, at every new organization, I have to convince people that that's okay. When I have vice presidents, it's cabinet, whatever they call it. And that I can see if people don't know you, they're sure, right. He likes to be challenged, but I'm not doing it first. I'm going to wait and see what happens to the other person. So you go through that until people learn, well, it is okay. It is okay. But that's the only way you're going to learn. But it's a funny story, but it did, be funny or not, it was to me, the importance of what you say as a director. So when I was here early on, we had a luncheon or something. We had cheesecake, and New York style cheesecake. And I thought this was great. I like cheese. I don't eat it now. I can't, kind of lactose intolerant. But I like the cheese. And I said, wow, it's great cheesecake. I love cheesecake. Every time we had an affair, they had cheesecake. I said, right. So one day, I asked my assistant, I said, why do they serve cheesecake all the time? She said, don't you know what they serve? Because you said you liked cheesecake. Right. And that story has stuck with me in the sense, be careful what you say. Not so much what you say, but the signals you send, because it does matter. I mean, what a director, a president, a CEO does, interestingly, it can matter more than one thinks.
There we go.
That's a question, though, I think.
Yeah, another question.
Do you still have cheesecake? No.
Hey, no, that's right. Please.
I'm curious from a high-level viewpoint how you see evolving the mix of applied science and fundamental science that goes on at our national laboratories. Certainly, our push is more and more to produce results, it seems. But somehow or another, there has to be that mix. And I'm just curious from a management down structure, how you see that ratio and in fact, what criteria you think is a reasonable application in those areas.
I can't answer that about the lab now. I'm just not, even as a member of the Board of Governors, we don't get into that level of detail. But I think as a trend in science that I'm pretty sure is happening, I've seen that this distinction has just become much more blurred. when I was at the National Science Foundation, our primary mission was, not primary, but the overwhelming amount of the funding was to go towards investigator-initiated research, grants scientists propose, and not applied or not research-driven by results that one could anticipate. That's just seemed to me to have changed so much. I mean, the scale of science, the problems one has to address, the way people are working across not just disciplinary boundaries, but across these boundaries of applications and pure research. So I presume that's happening here also. I know it's happening at the university, and it's happening, I think, among the younger scientists that I am, and I'm not in contact as much as I used to be, that I see fewer and fewer of them seeing themselves in one camp or another, unless they are, in a field like astrophysics or really cosmology. But anything having to do with materials or chemistry or biology, I'm not sure that boundary is as sharp.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of give you my view on that.
Yeah.
I think fundamentally I agree with you. The boundary isn't sharp, and I think it's quite complicated. Let me first sort of put a concern actually about academic research, which was individual investigative research. And I can say that because I've been in that for a long time. And what I've seen in that is that a lot of fundamental research has become much shorter term.
Much shorter term?
Much shorter term, right? It's very easy to do short-term fundamental research, which is, intended to get you the next FISREV ladder so that you can move on, right? Mm-hmm. It's not. So one of the things I'm concerned about actually in the fundamental sciences is the inability to engage on fundamental programs over long term, because that's where you get an impact. So it's a sort of a different response from what people would often say. And I have my own view about this, is that what fundamental research is an engine of is really very hard problems. When you're, addressing, hard problems in nuclear physics or astrophysics, you're forced to think really hard about how to get to some serious end goals, something that's challenging. And that forces you to do lots of stuff. It forces you to invent technologies which have never been invented before, methods, thinking, training, all of those things. And that by itself lifts a lot of technology. And we see a lot of experience of that. And then the other side of this is to look at problems which are, frankly, societal. Take global warming, take energy, take all of those big issues that we've had, and to recognize that these are century-long problems that we have to attack, and we should think of them in the same way as the grand challenge science problems that we have, and focus our resources and go after them in the long term, which typically means more fundamental science on those problems and not less.
One of the things that does concern me is I think that it's easy for the general public and even the informed public to remember, the source of things, especially now that we're in such a digital age and people are really digitally sophisticated. No one really appreciates the fundamental physics, no one, but I mean in the general public. People don't appreciate, the fundamental science that underpins all of that technology that now people take for granted. And so if you can write an application or you can work on a digital software or whatever, you can do that, but that's become what is seen now as the forefront of science to people. That's what they see as science, not solid-state physics, not the underpinning of a lot of the things. When I was at the NSF, we published a book called Retrospectroscope. It was like looking back in time to sort of take any technology and trace it back to the fundamental science that underpins it. I think we probably need more things like that. I was on a interview for PBS programs. Actually, it's going to be broadcast next week. Might be of interest to you because I speak about argon. And the interviewer challenged me on the following issues. That Science is not moving things. Why aren't things moving more rapidly from scientific research into society to improve society? You know, and I had the challenge. I said, you know, things are moving much more rapidly than they did in probably any time in our history. Well, but we haven't cured this disease. We haven't done that. And I said, you know, one thing I think, we've spoiled the public. You know, we've led them to believe that problems can be solved, you know, sort of easily, and that there are not left any hard problems that take a long time simply because they are hard to solve, and you have to invest in the research and science that allows you to solve those problems. Yeah. So that's my pet peeve.
So actually, we'll look for the PBS documentary. We'll spot that one. Yeah. Other questions?
Doctor, I just wanted to ask, what would you advise scientists, especially those who are at the beginning of their career, to spend more of their time on than they might think they should, and what they should spend less of their time on than they likely think they should?
Why don't you go first?
Yeah. There's a course of your career through science. I mean, I just think to what I did. So when Walter was coming here, I was turning up at Bell Labs as a postdoc. Okay? And the only thing I was focused on when I was doing that, and I think that was exactly the right thing, was the science I was doing right there and then, picking a really good problem, solving it, beating the head of over all of the other theoretical physicists to prove that I was smarter than that. Right? That was and you know, at an early stage in your career as a scientist, I think you must do that. Right? Yeah. You must own a problem, and I don't think that's ever changed. But then, you know, mid-career is something where you need to change gear. Well, some people need to change gear. Not everybody needs to change gear. I mean, we all know, you know, the lab rats who've been there for 80 years and are going to carry on going. But to begin to think about why you've chosen a problem, why you've chosen an area, and also to begin to build collaborations. So what has changed, I think, a lot in science over the last few years is that we work in much bigger teams, and we work in diverse teams, diverse of all kinds. And the mistake that typically young scientists made, and that I made, certainly, was to assume that because I'm a theoretical physicist, I knew how to do absolutely everything. And
that's true, though, but that's true.
Right. There we go. That's right. But then it sort of suddenly struck me that actually working on a team with a chemist and an engineer, and to deal with people who turned up on a problem, so I don't think about the problem the way that you do. I think about it in a different way. And to understand that to get a diversity of opinions on a problem that you're working with, and diversity is not just a diversity of disciplines, but a diversity of viewpoints, which comes from backgrounds and the way you think about problems and how people interact. And the other thing I learned, by the way, early on is collaborate with women. You know, many of my most productive collaborations came because you know, I found a group of very strong female collaborators early in my career, and they sustained me, actually, in a way, in a community way that I think is not so easy in a community that consists entirely of men.
I would certainly agree with it's the course of the career. And, you know, when you're starting out as a young scientist, that's what you do. And what I would say, what I've said to my students over the years and the young people is, first of all, you have to master something. I mean, before you can really make a contribution in any other way. You really do. You have to do that. And I really had to face that in a personal way when I got my PhD and came to Argonne, because the 1960s, I received my PhD in 1966, and I think maybe there were 10, 15, probably no more than 15, African-American PhDs in physics in the country. We all knew each other. And this was the time of great turmoil, you know, in society, the civil rights movement. Things were happening on college campuses. And I was at a laboratory, and I was doing research in physics, not just in physics, theoretical physics, not just that, I mean, some esoteric branch of that. So what was I contributing to society? You know, what was I doing as a Black American with a PhD to help with these social issues? And I had to really struggle with that. And I had a graduate student at Brown, physics student, and he was not a Black student, and not that many Black students in physics, period, still then. And he actually dropped out because he really felt he had to go do something in the community that he had. And I tried to convince him that he would make a bigger difference by, you know, staying there, getting his PhD, then he could be a major influence. Well, maybe I was right or wrong, but I did feel that, even looking back, that having, and it's proven true for me, I know I've been able to do more things because I did those things well. You know, I established a minor reputation, you know, in the field of physics that I was working in. I do think as one matures and you move on, that it really is important for scientists to learn how to communicate to the broader public about what we do or what scientists do. And I've seen some people who just never learned and never felt comfortable with doing that, and not everybody will. But that's a role, I think, as what one matures, that's something you should take as a responsibility for being a scientist, you know, to communicate about scientists so that the enterprise has support for the next generation.
There's a question over here. Right.
Hi, Walter. If memory serves, I think you were one of the people who were seminal in trying to build Chicago as a high-tech community, to develop the venture capital community, to develop tech transfer. I wonder if you could talk about that a bit.
That's true. The question was about work in Chicago and developing Chicago as a high center for high technology, it was called then. Actually, this grew out of an event we had at the lab. There's an organization in Chicago called the Economic Club. It consists of CEOs, and not just CEOs, but senior executives from all over the city. And each year they have something called Fifth Night, where they go somewhere and take the entire club, maybe 300 or 400 people, for a nice dinner. And they asked, could they have it here at the lab? It's 1980. And we thought it was great. It was bringing 300 or 400, you know, people in the influential corporate community of Chicago to the lab. And we had a dinner. I think we put up a tent over by the OZGS building. And I spoke about the contributions that I thought Argonne and science and technology could make to economic development in Chicago. And you remember, this was the era of the Rust Belt fears. You know, Detroit was crumbling, which it did, and Silicon Valley was rising. And Chicago was seen to be the next victim of this Rust Belt deterioration. So in my remarks, I pointed out all the resources we have in Chicago, our universities, our national laboratories, to help create a kind of high technology center here. And the mayor was there, Jane Byrne, the mayor of Chicago, was there, and she picked me up on it. So she appointed a task force on high technology development and asked me to chair it. And that led to something called the Chicago High Tech Association. And we really did bring together people from the labs, the universities. We got the governor involved ultimately, in local industry. And that's when we had research in industry. We had Motorola Labs. We had Amoco Chemicals, and we did work with Amoco Chemicals. AT&T had a lab over here. I mean, we really did have industrial partners in the area with whom we could work. So that was, I think that did have some ripple effects. We started, you know, that now, 30, 40 years later, I think these things are re-emerging again.
I agree. Just looking at the clock, I know there's
One more.
Oh, shall we take one more? Very good, thanks.
Hi.
Nobody over here has had a question, is that?
Well, I know the lab is trying to develop strong ties with the city of Chicago and the academic and industry resources that are here. But how does the lab reach out of Chicago? As someone who was raised in this state, K through 12 and even undergrad, I'd never heard of argon. And I was not raised in the Chicago area. Maybe it's one of the reasons why I got a job here, I don't know. But it is my question is, how does argon extend its outreach and leadership role to even within Springfield or local regions within the Midwest? And if there was a way to do that to where it just doesn't highlight Chicago.
Right. I mean, I think there's, you know, there's no simple answer to these questions, right? So that, you know, outreach is, in the end, a one-on-one activity. It's useful if the lab director can get the mayor at that level, but it's useful for each one of us to explain what we do to our colleagues, to take the opportunity to talk about our science and to explain what argon does. And I think it's probably important for argon to have a message that we can give to you to speak on our behalf. So, you know, one of the things, by the way, that we've been trialing with the support of the board and a lot of help of Walter is, in fact, a message about what is argon. That's produced, I think, a very interesting video. And to talk about argon, by the way, not in terms of a laundry list of what we do and how we interact, but in terms of a much bigger view about what is this organization and how does it play, why are people here, what are our goals, what do we look like, how do we work, what do we do. But that I think is, you know, it's a continuing work in progress. So you have to do a lot of this. You do it at all of the different political levels. You do it by working with industry. You do it by getting to be a little bit more regional. You know, it turns out that you know, we are, you know, the Midwest lab. You know, there are you know, Representative, you know, Nancy Cantor from Ohio thinks we're her lab.
Good.
You know, that's kind of important, actually. And we are, actually. But, you know, but it's done in many different ways. I don't think one can have one big program. One has to have lots of things. And the board, by the way, has been very helpful. I mean, Walter, you may have some view about where we should be going next, because it's,
no, I think you're right. I appreciate that comment, but you have to focus your resources. So you don't want to spread too thinly. And probably the best way to get those messages out is to be selective in ways to form relationships with organizations and other areas. But a lot of that can be done, as Peter said, through, I mean, you know the people in the community there. There are people in a high school or a local organization should be invited up to the lab, or a scientist should speak to them. I think that's probably a very important way to spread the message.
I'm conscious of the time. I know there are probably quite a few more questions out there. But so, Walter, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks. Good to be here.